Okay, so to illustrate what was happening between native communities and the British colonies and what later became, or the European colonies and what later became the United States, I'll illustrate that through the life of this woman here, whose name was Kusapona Kisa. She lived from 1700 to 1765, so her life spanned this first half of the 18th century, in which the British colonies started to transition into what became the United States. So she was born in 1700 to a prominent Creek woman. We don't know what her name was, and an English trader named Edward Griffin. And so she grew up in Coweta, which is a lower Creek town, and was steeped in the Creek culture. She spent her first 7 years of her life there, and then she went to live with her father's family in Carolina, where she spent the next 8 to 9 years of her life. And so she was steeped in both the Creek culture and the English culture. And so she knew both languages very well. She knew both religions and how they worked quite well. In 1716, she had moved back to Coweta, where her maternal uncle, whose name was Brims, he was the Miko, or the headman of the of Coweta and the most powerful Creek political leader in the area. And he was negotiating an end to the Yamasee War with the colonists from the Carolinas. So to help seal the agreement, Brims agreed that Kusapona Kisa would marry the son of one of the Carolina peace commissioners, whose name was John Musgrove. She got the Christian name Mary, and John Musgrove also spoke Creek, and he had a Creek mother, and so they were both these biracial people who were now married, and so they lived for the next 20 years or so, 15 to 20 years, both with the Creeks and with the English in what was then the colony of Carolina. So here's where the Yamasee War was taking place. At this time, all of this was just called Carolina in the early 18th century. And the Musgroves decided to move to an area south of the Savannah River, and so they moved to this area nearby the coast of Georgia right there. That was a serendipitous move, because they moved there early in the 1730s, and in 1732, an Englishman named James Oglethorpe moved there to establish the colony of Georgia. And so the Musgroves became the kind of primary intermediaries between the British colony of Georgia and the Creek natives, who were still very powerful in the area. So the Musgroves became the number one supplier of the various goods that the English wanted from the natives, and things like deer skins and food that the English needed. And she was also very important because her cousins were now the Mikos of two prominent towns of the Creek Confederacy, and so she was able to make very favorable agreements. And so she and John became actually pretty wealthy as a result of being in this strategic location, having this land. So they got land granted to them by the Creeks, and that was legally recognized by the English. And by virtue of controlling that, they controlled the trade in between and became decently wealthy. And it was interesting that both of these biracial people, and it goes to show how kind of the racism and things like that that we think of today, they didn't really exist at this time. I mean, people like this were actually extremely important. And that relationship continued until the 1740s. By that time, John Musgrove had died, and Mary had married another Englishman, a man named Thomas Bossomworth, in 1744. So part of the problem that the Bossomworths had with the now expanding colony of Georgia was that Georgia owed them a decent amount of money, and what Mary wanted was to get compensated by the British government or the colony of Georgia for providing them the stability and the goods that they had needed to survive for the last about 15 years. And they wouldn't do that. They actually forbade her from making some of the deals she had previously made and said that under English law, she could not sell her land. She petitioned the British government for reimbursements that Georgia was supposed to pay them, and that legal fight went on for a good 15 more years. It wasn't until 1759 that that dispute was resolved. Essentially what happened was that she was allowed to sell some land to the British government and or the colonial government, and then they allowed her to keep some of it, and then just kind of ignored her debts. And they were happy with that resolution. And then for her last few years of her life, until she died in 1765, she was still a very important mediator with the Creeks and maintaining Creek-Georgian relations. And her status as the daughter of a prominent Creek woman who had these cousins who were the Micos. Again, the Creeks were matrilineal, and so her status as the daughter kind of made her, in Creek terms, the dominant person in her relationship. So what her life illustrates is an era in Native American history in which several powerful, favorably located tribes were able to become diplomatically assertive when it came to dealing with Europeans. They were able to still control some of their destiny despite being in a declining situation where the colonies were getting more and more powerful and the natives really weren't growing their populations. She was able to navigate the intricacies of Native European diplomacy and did it pretty well. We're going to see a number of natives try to do this, and not all of them as successfully as she did. So the general themes of the end of the colonial period were mostly peaceful. There wasn't a ton of large-scale fighting during this time, although there was intermittent conflict that would occasionally break out. And when conflict broke out, that was usually bad for the natives because usually the communities would suffer and disease would spread. Europeans would extend their trade networks, especially with fur, but also began to expand their agricultural holdings, and this became a problem for natives because the South especially started increasingly basing its economy on slave-based agricultural production, and that was very land-intensive, very land-hungry. However, natives who were able to maintain their intermediary status like the Musgroves, they were able to maintain this diplomatic balance, and that balance would keep them pretty powerful until it didn't. And we're going to see how that could occur. And indeed, when that native balance of power with Europeans fell apart, that actually was the impetus for the creation of the United States.